France, that had at least 8 million population in 1990 and 20% of extreme poverty, there's places there where poverty probably halved in the number of extreme poor people. Ghana and Ethiopia are probably the two countries where this has happened, while there's actually 7 more countries that actually where the number of extreme poor people has doubled. Now, if you compare that to Asia, in Indonesia or in Bangladesh or even in India, we're talking about a halving of the number of extreme poor people in this period since 1990. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we have countries where this has actually been going up and indeed doubling. Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar are definitely the clearest places there in that respect where it's happening. So that's differentiation, even on a continent that generally is considered, oh, it's a difficult place. But actually, we have different trajectories that are being experienced now in some of these countries. It's not that simple. It's all about natural resources. Malawi doesn't have them, and also managed to double number of extreme poor people in the country. So it's not simply a natural resource abundance story as well. If we start looking at GDP growth, one important thing, and sometimes in discussions like this, people get a bit annoyed that I talk quite a lot about growth, but, of course, growth has to be inclusive, and that's an important part. But we also know that without sustained growth, no country has ever sustainably reduced extreme poverty dramatically over time. You need to grow the pie in these places. Of course, you want to be as exclusive as possible, and especially natural resource abundant places, you can have these periods of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years of fast growth with nothing happening. But it doesn't mean that growth doesn't remain an important part for these very poorest places. Now, in this period since 1990, of course, we know the exceptional story of China, and that makes the rest of the world look all in the developing world all as if not that much has happened. China was hugely exceptional in terms of what happened there. But of course, we see on the picture also Indonesia that now has had this kind of 50 years of pretty high growth with occasional dips, but actually remarkable steady progress that it has known, and also incredible success in extreme poverty reduction. And then you get quite the other countries, exceptional growth in China or Vietnam. But if we now take China out of the picture and also Indonesia, we get actually this kind of sense of differentiation. Indonesia, Cambodia, if you can see it as well, they are not like your standard East Asian country in the way they did it. These are much more complicated places with governance challenge, institutional challenge, definitely on the early stages of development or even now, but they make this steady progress. Or Bangladesh, that is actually, early 1990s, early 1980s, the team of Henry Kissinger called it a basket case, but then actually was transforming, and we know about the quite remarkable success that it has had, not just in growth and partly to garments and ready-made garments, but also in the social sectors, and not necessarily through the state as it was typically in East Asia, but actually did it also to a large extent to NGOs. And I know Australia and Britain worked strongly together on supporting BRAC, that is the largest NGO in the world. And when I talk in Africa, I keep on talking about it to say, look, don't just look at what happened in Vietnam or China, just look at places like Bangladesh, quite messy places in the way they're governed, the way the state is organized, and I'll say more about it in a moment, but actually succeeding in doing quite remarkable things. Ethiopia, Ghana, both places with very fast growth in the 1990s, probably in Ethiopia since about 2000, and with hope now with the ceasefire and the peace deal, we can rejuvenate some of that progress after 2 years of internal conflict. Ghana, similarly, it's a bit in a crisis now, well, not bit more than just a little bit. It's in a deep crisis now with its debt situation, but has since the mid-1990s turned around and do remarkably well. Cote d'Ivoire is probably a country like that as well. But then you get stagnation or even declines, just like you get more your part of the world in Papua New Guinea, where it's relatively bumpy roads, but actually you'd say, look, this is not sustained progress. This is quite flat. Similar patterns in Nigeria, where brief periods of growth, but then flatness in the last 10 years in Nigeria has been dreadful, both in economic policy and in terms of progress. DRC is now still at the GDP per capita, that's only a third of what it was in 1970. Madagascar, often forgotten about it. I'll be going there fairly soon. Very few people often talk about it, but that's a declining trend. And now the country likely by 2030, the third largest country with the third largest number of extreme poor people there as well. So you get this differentiation that is actually happening. And what I want to do, and I want to just bring this back for a moment, is that maybe in the academic world, we stopped trying to understand these differences in a sensible way. And I will make this point a little bit clearer. You know, this is an old question. And there was a time that some people, you know, I was always a microeconomist, but some people thought, you know, we can make sweeping statements on the world and we can claim that we have big, clear sense of causalities as well with cross-country growth regressions. You know, there's a lot of people that would say, look, you can't quite do this because there's so many indicators that actually, that so many indicators come together, and even the way you do your IVs and whatever, it doesn't make that much sense. But it meant at the time, the 1990s, a lot of big picture stories were being developed, and essentially the questions that I am projecting now, that they actually were talking about it. We do this much less, and our big picture ideas are actually, you know, more difficult to get. And that was actually, in a way, what I was trying to do also in recent times, trying to actually go through a little bit, you know, what is now, if there's still dominant views, probably also in the policy world, but also maybe through, you know, people that write best-selling books about development and so on, what are the kind of big diagnoses that people are making in terms of what's wrong with the world? Now, one of the striking things, of course, what economists all over the world always do, they like to focus largely about what should be done, what to do, and so on. And I'll come back to that, because actually there's something there that creates also problems for on the policy side. But not that we shouldn't give this advice, but just the way we think about it at times. But if you think of the big competing diagnoses now in the way we approach in a big view development, there seems to be two competing ones. And the one they come back to maybe a bit like why nations fail, institutional economics, going from Douglas North to Acemoglu Robinson in more popular versions, backed up with quite solid research. We can still always argue about the way this is done. But what is very striking, that, you know, they talk about institutions in a fundamental sense as these rules of the game that seem to evolve over time, slowly through history. And in fact, the empirical world largely would say historical factors end up causing some of these institutions today. Now, that means we have strong evidence that history will cause institutions. Meanwhile, in the policy world, we go around, oh, well, it's the institutions that are therefore failing, and let's go and quickly fix them. Now, actually, the empirical base for us to say we're going to quickly fix these institutions is actually relatively weak, because the big picture view of the role of institutions on the big picture outcomes talk all about its history that tends to determine. Now, it's a really tricky one. You know, when I was a chief economist in Britain and I went up going around to places, if I went, and indeed I did quite often, to go into State House in Nigeria to see Buhari, some of his key people and vice president and so on, I couldn't go there as chief economist and tell them, look, the research has now told us that we know what drives long-term fast growth. You want to have growth, and I'll tell you my advice, and it is, do get a better history. Now, it's a bit of a hard one as your former colonial masters to come and tell you that. And sometimes I feel like that's the advice we tell them. Yes, history screwed up your places, and now you need to actually get a better history. So it's a bit of a tricky one, because that's why the empirical evidence is strongest, but it's not really that helpful. Now, it's at the same time, you have to realize then, so what is the advice that we can actually give them? And I don't think that literature in itself, beyond the diagnosis that is powerful, tells us what to do. Leonard Wonchakon, the economic historian based at Princeton, he comes from Benin, he actually puts it nicely. And even though he works on these historical things quite often, he has a tendency to actually say, well, and in one lecture he said, it's 50% history. If you look at today's outcomes, it's 50% history. but realize that there's another 50% that actually is about the actions today and that we're doing. And that's the kind of context, the thing that I'm much more interested in now. So what do we do now when we go to these places? And it's on top of that, what gives me then hope. If you then look at the Bangladeshis or the Indonesians, when they started to take off in their growth in a quite an inclusive way, they actually had quite, well, dare I say, rotten institutions. You know, in Suharto in the 1970s, he had come into power through violence with a coup. There was all kinds of issues there with deep corruption. He had, you know, arguably blood on his hands from the 1960s as a military leader. And on the other hand, you had an old nationalist set of families that clearly controlled state-owned enterprise, and they were corrupt. These contradictions, it took a long time to begin to get this resolved, but meanwhile they started to be more developmental and growth in that, with arguably, you know, a lot of corruption, a lot of issues. And, you know, yes, they may not have achieved this kind of South Korea growth rates, but they did remarkably well in terms of the progress. China, even in the 1970s, you know, let's not forget, end of the Cultural Revolution, the death of Mao, the Gang of Four, Mao's widow and others that tried to get power. You know, this was a country in turmoil. This was not, as Yuan Ang carefully argues in her book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. This was not a country with strong institutions at that moment. They were actually at a weaker point in their history. And in a sense, the Communist Party I remember very much as a youngster, discussions about, will China survive this? Will the Communist Party survive all these turmoil? And so in a sense, they do it when the institutions are definitely not strong. And so you kind of have to not simply say, yeah, of course, it's great that institutions get better. And we know in long-term growth and the richest country in the world have quite strong institutions, not perfect, let's never say that. But at the same time, what can you do at takeoff? You can't just wait until the institutions are right and think that's how we do it. If we now keep on plowing away, again, we don't quite have the evidence base, plus it is a longer term process how to do it. So it comes back to that other point, get your policies right. What are your actions? Now, what is important, and I'm not here promoting some kind of Burnside dollar 1990s, as long as you do Washington consensus policies that we can pre-code, and I'm putting a cross-country growth regression, and therefore we can show, if I manipulate my econometrics long enough, to actually prove that therefore, if we do Washington consensus economic policies, everything will be fine. No, it's both flawed methodologically, we would say these days, but also we have learned when we look at countries that have taken off, they did a larger set of kind of policies than normally as Western agencies where we're promoting. And we have to be honest about it, that actually, and in fact, Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner, when he did the Growth Commission report in 2007, was very honest in saying, look, if you look at the countries that were successful for 30 years of growth of more than 7%, they did a broader set of economic policies than a narrow set. And he said, look, I don't know the recipe for growth. At least we know the ingredients, but within it, there is room for maneuver. You can do it a more infrastructure-led one, probably. You can do more focus on the market, maybe do a bit more on the state if the state capabilities are there. So there is actually a bit of choice of how you go about it, you know, and that's actually useful for me as an advisor. If you deal with slightly ideological masters, as we always have to do working in government, you know, there's a little bit of room for maneuver, as long, and this is where the UK with Liz Truss was quite relevant, as long as you're willing to correct yourself after a bit if you make a big boo-boo, a big mistake in terms of how you do it. But it's a larger set than can you do it. The question becomes much more, if it is about much more about the actions and behaviors of those people who make policies. So why don't they do sensible things? Why does Buhari in Nigeria have 7 exchange rate and persists, even though they full know well that it breeds corruption and that secondly, it really screws up policy certainty in the macroeconomy? So why do they do stupid policies, if I may put it as bluntly as this? So this is in a bit what I wanted to actually talk about through case studies in my book. And it came very much was brought home, and I will hurry up now. It was brought home to me when I was, as chief economist, went to different government departments, prime minister's office in developing countries. In 2 cases, I was invited to the prime minister's office and I wanted to discuss the development plans. I went to the DRC and I went also to the Ethiopia, that's on the right. And in DRC, I went there and we were met there really with a team of Prime Minister Sponio's advisors, and they presented us the development plans. What I do remember of them, they printed the whole morning presentations. That was actually pretty good. The development plan, we're talking about 8 years ago, the development plans were actually pretty good for agriculture, for the macroeconomy, for infrastructure, for education, for health. They were both sensible in terms of the research. They were sensible in terms of how to deal with the Washington institutions. They were actually also sensible in terms of what the context was. And say, wow, if you were to put yourself behind this could actually be really good for the country. And I remember also walking out of the room together with a Congolese colleague from the embassy, and he said to me, "Quel spectacle." And we started laughing. Quel spectacle means like, what a show. What a show have we just seen? Because we knew full well that nothing would ever happen with any of these plans. And indeed, in the 8 years since then, nothing of these plans were ever implemented. And that's very striking. We go to Ethiopia a couple of months later. There we are, the government, very high-level meeting, a retreat, essentially a day and a half. A finance minister, his key team, a prime minister's advisor, deputy prime minister, governor of the central bank, and we brought some other experts. They wanted a diverse set of experts, so we brought, so I was there together with Justin Lin, former chief economist from China with his particular views, Paul Collier, very different views, Lant Pritchard, definitely very different views and entertaining views, very different things. And we spent a day and a half discussing with them their plans. And I do remember, they were definitely not perfect. They were not just not orthodox, they were not heterodox even, it was kind of non-orthodox. They were, interesting, you're going to try that, will it work? Not sure. And we had long discussions, lots of comments, and a lot of worries on all parts, whether it actually would succeed or not. But I remember with the experts, when we then left a bit later on from that place, we had a bit of a debrief amongst each other, and we all concluded that A, they were likely going to do this, and actually, it may well be successful. And Ethiopia became one of the fastest growing economies in the world between 2005 and 2020. So in these 8 years since then, they have grown really substantially up to COVID, and the internal strife stopped it to some extent. But they did remarkably well, and these plans were implemented and they were trying to do it. Now, for me to understand that, you do need to go, yes, a bit back to political economy and the analysis of states. So Douglas North, Weingast and Wallace, they have a great book that talk about a lot of things. And there, they have these views, and there's lots of things I don't necessarily agree with there, but it's really fascinating book. They basically say it really helps when you look at the state as fundamentally a coalition to first and foremost to have a form of peace and stability. A bit of what Manger Olson talked about, we're going to go from roving bandits, militias roving the countryside, to actually saying, well, why don't we all work together, we get some stability, and we'll become, in the first instance, maybe stationary bandits, okay? So the idea of a dominant coalition for control of valuable resources and to valuable activities by some group of elites. And in a sense, what it is there in that book, that the idea is saying, think of the state as an elite bargain historically, and I would say, think of any state that we experience as a form of an elite bargain amongst leading groups of how the country is run. And I would say, look, even the UK has still a strong sense of it, because if you think of it, we have remarkable laws. And for example, one would be, if you happen to have, one would imply the following: if you happen to be someone who came across in 1066 with some Norman knights, maybe you carried a sword of a Norman knight, and you turned out to be on the winning party of William the Conqueror's armies in Britain, there's a good chance that even though you were maybe a lower knight or someone carrying a sword or whatever, you were given land, and it's very likely that your family today are still millionaires because, your ancestors had something done there, and that's inheritance rights. We do certain things about controlling access to resources in ways that are peculiar. There's no reason why this person that has this land should actually have these rights of control. with any of their own action, but it's just some historical quirk that 1,000 years ago or something was done. And so this is how I want to think about states as fundamentally, as it was in the introduction, as an elite bargain amongst those with power and influence. And I talk about elite there because partly in the policy space, we have the habit of only talking to a minister or to a prime minister and thinking that they have all the power. You know, that's absolutely not the case. You have to always think about, you know, what is in the end, what is the coalition of power that we have here? And power is not just the government or the parliamentary party. It will be businesses, it will be senior civil servants, it will be the military class, the leading military, it may even be civil society leaders, it may well be leading journalists, it may be Rupert Murdoch and people like that. You know, they are essentially part of the elite and the elite bargain in the state. And you have to just understand that what it is. And it's in the minimum coalition for peace and stability. And it is in the end always something to do with politics about controlling the state and economics. And you can have lots of them. And I'm really going to hurry up now a little bit. You have, can have lots of them. You could have, for example, as we see, a state where the main purpose of the elite bargain is to steal from people. You know, the pure stationary bandits kind of stuff. You know, kleptocratic states, you know, where basically you get into power and you use all you can to actually steal from businesses, from the natural resources that are there and do other things. So kleptocratic states, that could be the elite bargain that we have. You know, Mobutu Sese Seko in DRC definitely run a kleptocratic states. Kabila afterwards definitely did it. You could also have a bit like how we think a bit like a version of that in the oligarchic state, you know, where there's a political deal with a small group of people together with some oligarchs that control the big businesses and then mutually enforce it themselves, a bit like, of course, what you know with Putin in Russia. Or we have a clientelist state where basically, if you come to power, it is your time to eat, as famously was a slogan that was used in Kenya. It's our time to eat where you get into power. And basically, you will then to give to your people jobs, benefits, or indeed, you give to your jobs the contracts. And, you know, we have so many states in the places I work that have clientelisting. And by the way, many states, also the UK, still has features of that all the time as well. How do you then get growth and development? And for me, the main thesis of the book is that if you want development, you actually need to have a state where that elite bargain is not just as I just described, but has enough features that the underlying commitment is for longer term to grow the pie and to have actually a commitment to growth and indeed to inclusive development. And that, I think, distinguishes a lot of these states. And maybe also has what China and Bangladesh may have had in common is actually that. Nothing more than that of how they did it, but have that. If I go to Africa, Ghana and Ethiopia is that thing. And it's about being serious about peace and stability because that's the nature of an elite bargain. But it's also knowing what your state can do. If you in China have a long history of the state being set up meritocratically with state exams and civil servants being selected really competitively, and you have a meritocratic state, you may actually achieve quite a lot. If you're in Bangladesh, much more clientelist state in what was set up, you actually have to make the choice that the state is not going to do everything because you're not going to get there. If I go to Malawi or most African countries, it won't be like that. And then the important thing, I've alluded to it, you know, things will go wrong because you do not know the recipe for growth and development in your country and how to keep this going. And you'll need to have moments of correction. And that is what distinguishes successful countries, that they have internally, externally, find these things in the case studies that discuss it. And it's important. It's not about perfection. It's not about state of the market. It's actually not even about the political system per se, as long as you have built-in systems of error correction. And then it's important. It is a gamble for the elite. And that's actually why it is so hard sometimes to get it in some messy places, for example, where there's a lot of natural resources. The status quo is very attractive for the elite. And you actually have to get them to want to do actually to go for growth and to progress in ways that actually is really a gamble for them. And the gamble of the 1970s in Indonesia is interesting, where Japanese investment against a lot of pushback from the traditional elites, they were allowed in, and a new elite gets created, or certain local groups get strengthened, and that changes, in the sense, the elite composition also in Indonesia, and then begins to change and get challenges. And indeed, you know, there will be ruptures and there will be things. And the way a society can handle that and rethink these elite bargains is actually important. Ghana at the moment goes through a deep crisis. They had in the mid-1990s, they found their formula. It's to do with the getting a political deal in the end that could function for the country. They had a lot of stability politically. They could grow for 20 years really well. They now have a new crisis that clearly needs a new elite deal to actually how we're going to deal with this. And then finally, and quickly, but importantly, what about aid? And I spent a lot of time on the other stuff because the outsiders, we are outsiders. We don't have that big a role in these places. The change really has to come from inside, and at best we can support the change that is coming. And so you have three types of countries. Countries with a development bargain, where actually they are really committed with progress in growth and development. Countries without one, where they totally have other objectives. I think of the DRC in that respect. And then countries that are a bit muddled, these messy places where maybe some groups may well want to do it, but it's really tough. There may be an emerging one, but it's not entirely clear. It's still messy. The governance is not very perfect. And in fact, in a lot of places, that's where we end up first. First of all, if you have country with a development bargain, our typical model of multilateral cooperation, for example, that's designed for that one. If the countries want growth and development, you know, the World Bank can do a good job. The problem, of course, is that the World Bank thinks or likes to behave as if every country wants this. That's where the problem is emerging. But if you have it, and by the way, a lot of countries are moved to that, and even if it's not perfect, I would say that's where we just support them. We give budget support, we work with government systems, support their plans. That's where all the wonderful world of RCTs, that by the way, I do myself as well, we can come in, we work with them, experiment, try out new things, try to improve implementation, do it. And actually, aid is easy. And arguably, in some of these Asian countries, aid was easy, even with all the shortcomings. In Vietnam, they wanted development. They staked their legitimacy on it. In Bangladesh, interestingly, they created a space for development. As Naomi Hussain, in an interesting book, The Aid Lab, describes, aid was really welcome and allowed to actually try out things as well, working with civil society, working with government, and it's a great place. Now, that's easy. But what you do then if there's no development bargain? What do I do in Nigeria? What is the point of aid? If the elite bargain is fundamentally not really interested in development and growth, but all about the division of the oil rents and still like that, even at the cost of mass stagnation. If I analyze why does Buhari have 7 exchange rates? Because it serves the people that he owes in the end money to for his underlying progress. And basically it gives chance for what they call round tripping, corruption. But meanwhile, the fixed exchange rate gives an enormous protection to certain types of industries that are totally non-profitable in a competitive environment, but can consist. So what do we do with aid there? We do give a lot of aid in Nigeria. Health aid forever. Maybe we say, well, we have to do good because child mortality instances are so bad. Now, the one thing we have to now warn you against is that you embed possibly bad elite bargains. Nigeria is a country that spent least as a share of its government budget on health. Are we actually really being helpful to actually do it in their place? Are we really helpful in South Sudan when I go there to meetings, first of all with the government to say, oh, we love the donors, so we don't really have to pay attention to health and education. They do it for us. And then you go, it was during the conflict, I go behind enemy lines, I talk to rebel commanders, and I said, oh, what do you think of the NGOs here? All I said, oh, we love the NGOs. It's really good that they're here, that they are here and do all the social sectors and the food distribution. So because they allow us to get on with the business of war. That's humanitarian aid in South Sudan. So what are we doing? Okay, I'm not saying we shouldn't do good, but we should ask these questions. But we also should be honest and say we're not doing development in these places. We're doing SN band-aids, we're doing stuff like that. Okay, and then finally, in the places where there's an emergent bargain. Now, then actually, this is where we also gamble as an international community. I see something, I think it's worth trying. I'm going to try to gamble, but if my bet fails, I'm actually going to change strategy. I'm not going to do it like this much longer. We're not going to do 60 years of the same stuff in these places as we do in certain places. We really have to think so much more carefully, where are we getting through what we're doing, and try, but willing to gamble. You know, don't be, as we usually do, the moment we see that $5 of our aid is used corruptly by a ministry, oh, we have to stop aid to that ministry until they have their public financial management sorted. No, this stuff happens, you know, happens in the UK too, maybe less, but it will happen as well. No, it's not like that. But if you really say, look, these guys are just not interested, we can't really work with them, you gamble with them and you try. And what you then do is then actually you work hard at increasing the odds of improving or indeed make the elite bargains better. So you try to strengthen those who actually are favoring a better elite bargain in the kind of system that you operate in, or you definitely don't try to support people that just embed bad stuff. Even if they are the Minister of Health and Education, I would not work with them. The important thing that you can do internationally is definitely on illicit finance. A lot of bad politics in the developing world is financed by illicit finance. It's not about the tax that they don't have. I never wanted to give Buhari or Kabila in the DRC in Nigeria more money. No, I want to stop the way they finance their politics. And that's through illicit finance blocking it. Indeed, trade has definitely proven another way, because trade, export-oriented growth requires a long-term vision. It needs a certain stability, and it strengthens certain types of elite, as indeed has happened in many of the countries like Indonesia or Vietnam as well. And then always thinking through local politics and development, and then strengthen, if we can, the agency of those in the elite and those who can make a change, or let new elite players come in. I focus on the elite here because we shouldn't be naive. You know, grassroots is great and it's doing good very well. The process by which grassroots really can do change is long-term and probably historical as well. The elite have blocking power. It's at some point the elite players that need to stop able to block. You know, why did it take so many centuries in Europe? Because elites were not willing to shift. Even if you have labor movements for decades in the 19th century, it took a long time also to change. It's that blocking power makes me want to talk about the elites, but we can see whether we can find entry points, working with civil society, maybe getting good technocrats with political nous, working it and strengthen them. I think the IMF, surprisingly, or actually not surprisingly, because I think there's some smart people often with them, were really good at strengthening central banks in Africa. And it was a big part getting these technically strong, but also politically to move them on. But never forget that we are outsiders in these places. So how do you organize aid to do so? I know that you did well before the FCDO doing some things like that. First of all, what I really find problematic is that the main thing that everybody seems to be talking about today, and has been doing this for more and more, it's always about money only. The best things is not about money. It's about using relatively modest resources really well, and just increasing the checks. It's not really going to make a difference. I worry so much with the climate finance discussions that without what is happening locally in the countries, a lot of that finance will not spend. I would love to give the countries that have really a development focus and indeed a growth focus really a chance to green their growth and doing it. But there's a lot of places I really worry about all that language, because it's all about finance. And of course, anyone, a really good government, but also a crooked government, loves more money. And so you really want to be careful with that. I want to focus on emphasis. And I'm basically would be tempted to say, therefore, we join with the foreign ministry. Maybe that's what we should be doing. You know, I will definitely say, having lived through it for 2 years, working in the top of the office as an advisor to the top man, merged aid and foreign policy is not necessarily best. And I can tell you that the case study in the UK will say, oh my God, what have we done? Okay. And I've definitely been writing about it now. I think we've probably destroyed development. And fortunately, there's now a much better minister now. There's at least some people, including in number 10, that are beginning to think, oh my God, what have we done? And indeed, what have we done in the UK? And the reason is not because it has to fail. Indeed, I wrote positively about it, that we could achieve something. But, you know, foreign ministries by their nature, and my God, did I experience that, are incredibly focused on the short term, the relationship. They're very short-term relationship management. It's exactly often very transactional. Oh, what is my little business doing today with a contract that is blocked in that country? Very reactive. Ooh, what will the Murdoch press write about us tomorrow morning if we don't do something about this? They are terrible at actually focusing on long-term politics. And I would say even at times the political councillors are far too short-term. They have very little sense of the history and the longer-term strength and the networks and so on and all the things that happen. They have no clue usually about the economics and how economics and politics mixes. And they focus often on party politics and person X said this and person Y said this in the newspaper. That's not really what we're talking about. It's the longer-term trajectory of these places that we need to have visions and thoughts about. So it's not likely an issue, but importantly, you can do this well. But it's not likely that whether it's combined or separate that we will do this well. And I actually think it doesn't mean that I'm now arguing, oh, let's split the ministries again. Basically, you need smart people to act and allowed to act in a smart way. Okay, that's a very easy thing to do, but I can assure you, if you come from the development side, that's not quite the experience we had over the last 2 years in the UK. So if smart people have to be allowed to act smartly for the longer term, knowing that strategic patience is often far more important than what the Daily Mail will say the next morning. And if we can't handle that with our foreign policy and foreign office colleagues, then we can't do it. And then the really important thing here is that development policy is a long-term policy than the usual foreign policy stuff. You need to be very clear what you do with the objective on the development side. And you are trying to support a country. You're not, in the first instance, you're trying to support Australia and UK, but you support a country because you think in the long-term interest. This is either what our own voters want, because they want to be supportive internationally, or indeed it may be in the UK interest as well. And these are two different things, but we should not mix this all too much. It's about improving the lives of their lives and their society, and not in the first instance. If you're not able to do this in a joint department, now you better split it up again. In DFID, we could do this, but the rest of Whitehall hated us. So it didn't work either. We need to find that balance, and it's about understanding and indeed how to actually work together. Anyway, I leave it there. In sum, it's not about silver bullets and technocratic solutions, whether it's as an economist and other advisors. Think always through the local politics, what's going on. There are development bargains on the rise. And I really think we should be willing to gamble of them, even if at times it is really tough to stick it out. But don't be naive about these places, politics and open manners. And then the final thing for your aid stuff. I think the most important thing is that with that aid budget and the people you have and the technical skills you have, it's about, if you don't get a space politically that you say, look, this is about thinking through the development of Papua New Guinea. This is thinking through the development of the outer islands of Indonesia. This is about Bangladesh, its development, indeed, maybe in African countries for other places. If you're not allowed to do that, it's about their development. You're really not going to get there. You can't muddle it all the time. And the muddle is the one that frustrated me most. And then you have to have humility. You're the outsider. Just don't do all these fancy things. We do this, we did that, this kind of internal briefings, but also the Washington-based institutions, or New York for that matter. You don't do it. It's these people. You are not doing it. At best, you support those in the countries who are trying to make it happen. And that's how you should look about it. And then aid can be powerful. And then we can actually do quite remarkable things. Bangladesh and Ghana are two cases where they got as far as they got, also thanks to aid, but we use this complementary to the direction that these countries wanted to do. And I will stop now. Thank you very much.
Professor Dercon, thank you so much for that really stimulating and entertaining talk. I am sure that many people in this room have met some of those stationary bandits that you spoke of. I know I certainly have. We've got just a few minutes for questions. We will have to finish it, well, in about 5 minutes, I'm afraid. So we've got time for just a couple of questions before the welcome to country is done outside. So can I ask those who are interested in asking Professor Dercon a question to put your hands up? Okay, we have one question here. 1, 2. Let's start with 2 questions and see how we go. There's this gentleman in the middle, in the blue jacket.
Hi, thank you, Professor. I'm Didar. I'm from Abt Associate. Just a quick question. On the title you said about messy places. What actually define the messy places? And then do we have a different level of messy places in countries? How does that work? I mean, we have fragile context, unstable context, and then messy places.
We might, why don't we get the second question and then we'll go to Professor Dercon for an answer.
Thank you very much for that. I just have a question about conflict and the role of conflict in influencing development. I noticed in your intervention that there wasn't much reference to conflict except for the fact that in Ethiopia conflict undermined its development trajectory. One of the major causes of conflict around the world is unequal access to resources. And I'd like to understand whether you think land reform and addressing issues in relation to access to land should be one of the issues that development partners deal with at an early stage in fragile conflict contexts, or whether it's too sensitive for outsiders to embark on such discussions at such a fragile state of the development trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Dercon.
Yeah, look, on the first question, you know, when we use a framework and we're trying to actually discuss, you know, the kind of dichotomy or a division into three types of groups, you know, of course there is a certain fluidity. You know, I do think that we can quite well identify in a sensible way, if we sat together in a room and we would say who would we put in the extreme groups here of countries where there is, broadly speaking, a development bargain and broadly speaking not at all, we could do this. This is not an issue because it's a lot to do with the actions and the agency of those people who have power and influence in countries. It's very hard to actually always that indicator and whatever. So don't get stuck in this kind of simple dichotomy. Actually, I would simply say try to understand very well the kind of complexity of a place and try to, whether as a researcher and you try to think through how economic policies may work or advice may work through, or indeed as an agency, think through very carefully about how it may work through in that particular context given the local complexity. So I think it becomes so context specific to actually try to get a good sense of how can we work here, what can we do. So simple global categorizations will not be that helpful. But you know, we use these terms of fragile, and it's always a kind of a euphemism. I mean, I use sometimes this term now like that's messy because they're just complicated places to work in and complicated societies where the nature of the elite bargain is definitely, may well be complicated, but it's actually also unlikely to be directed towards a more clearer, singular vision on growth and development. And so I'm happy to have a dialogue on it over email further on this. On the question of conflict, okay, so in a sense, you know, even if a state fundamentally in the first instance is all about an elite bargain over peace and stability, as Douglas North talks about it, you know, the states in conflict, and in the book I do talk about them, you know, that actually is about elite fragmentation. And in itself, it's very hard to do development when there is actually not an underlying elite bargain. And we could talk, I'm next week going to actually to Ethiopia, spend some time there now that the peace deal is signed, to help to actually think through a little bit of that nature of that resetting. But the point that you made on the, you know, I would not say that in the language that was used, that conflict is typically started because of unequal access of resources in terms of a kind of a broad sense. It's about control of resources often, which is not quite the same. So land reform doesn't really necessarily address the idea that powerful groups want to control. And land reform may be a kind of thing, but actually I can't see us trying to push for land reform as outsider. That's quite a fundamental choice. This is actually fundamental choice about the rent deal in a country. We may well be in favor of it, but if a country wants to embark on it, first of all, you want to think very carefully through how it actually works through its society. And we have land reform that actually has been quite successful. Ethiopia had land reform during the 1970s, and at the time could hardly have been called successful in the 1970s. So you have to be very careful. So again, as outside, we need land reform. It's kind of an easy thing to do. You want to think about, you know, what is the nature of an elite deal that actually around control of resources here, that actually gives us the stability and that actually allows us for growth and development. And if you say it can't happen without getting poorer people access to land, well, that has to then a feature that you would hope for. But again, we're outsiders, and I'm not quite sure what examples you're thinking of in this particular case, but I would say it becomes then so dependent on the particular context.
Thank you very much, Professor Dercon. Please join me in thanking him for that brilliant lecture.
And allow me to quickly say one thing is that if other people want to answer questions, please send me an email and I will happily reply to it.
Great. Thank you very much for that generous offer. And thank you again for presenting to us tonight. I'm just here to remind everyone that the Indigenous Australian Welcome to Country is going to take place outside now, just at the main foyer, and then there's also going to be conference opening reception and drinks. So please attend both of those events. Okay, thank you very much.